Queen Camilla had been a part of the British royal family for many years, but as time passed, she found herself in an unfamiliar situation. She had always been seen as a figure of strength, but now, as queen consort, she was navigating a new chapter in her life. King Charles had recently ascended to the throne, and with that came increased attention, pressure, and expectations for Camilla. People in the royal court, the public, and even her family all looked to her as the new face of the monarchy. But despite her long tenure as a member of the royal family, Camilla had to quickly adjust to a different level of scrutiny that came with being the queen. It wasn't just about wearing crowns and attending lavish events anymore. It was about stepping into a position that came with a massive weight of tradition, history, and public opinion. There were long days of formal engagements, state dinners, and appearances with world leaders. Everywhere she went, eyes were on her, and her every move was analyzed by the press. To many, she was still considered the wife of a monarch. But not everyone had accepted her role as the queen consort, especially not in the hearts of the people who felt loyalty to the crown's traditions. One of the most sacred traditions in the royal family involved the Royal Guard, a group of highly disciplined soldiers who stood outside royal residences and at state events, always ready to salute the monarch. The salute was more than just a gesture. It was a symbol of respect and loyalty, a sign that the guards recognized the royal family's authority and the responsibility that came with it. Over the centuries, it had been passed down from one generation to the next, and it was a practice everyone in the palace had come to expect. The salute was not just about a simple gesture. It was a powerful reminder of the monarchy's place in the nation. Queen Camilla knew all this very well. She had watched King Charles command the respect of the royal guards with a firm yet calm presence. His authority was never questioned, and his word was law within the palace walls. Camilla, however, had a different approach. She was more accustomed to the quieter, behind-the-scenes role. She had supported her husband in his journey to the throne, but now that she was the queen consort, she needed to learn to step into a more commanding position, one that would match the expectations people had of her new role. The challenge was proving to be bigger than she had imagined. One crisp morning, the palace was abuzz with preparations for an upcoming state event. The grand hall was filled with royal staff, dignitaries, and servants, all making sure everything was in order. Camilla, who had been quietly moving through the palace, was dressed in her usual regal attire, a long, elegant gown paired with a stunning tiara. She walked with her usual air of elegance, but today, there was a spark in her eyes. She had made a decision that would test not just the guards, but the entire palace. Today, she would demand respect, in a way that she hadn't done before. It was a typical scene in the grand hall, with the guards lined up in their pristine uniforms, their tall hats giving them a strong and imposing appearance. The royal guard was always ready to perform their duties with the utmost precision. For many of the guards, the royal palace was more than just a workplace. It was a home, a place where they felt deeply connected to the history and legacy of the monarchy. They were the symbols of tradition, and they understood the weight of their responsibility. They had been trained for years to stand still, to salute at the right moments, and to never show any sign of weakness. But Camilla had begun to feel that the respect the royal guard had once shown was fading. The respect for the monarchy in general was beginning to feel fragile. She had heard whispers around the palace. Some of the younger guards, especially those who had joined more recently, seemed less eager to show the same deference to the queen as they did to King Charles. Camilla couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in behavior, the small moments when respect was not given, or when the royal traditions weren't followed to the letter. On this particular day, she felt something shift in her. Camilla had always been a graceful and measured person, but today she was determined to remind everyone around her of her position. She believed the royal guard needed to show her the same respect they had always shown King Charles. She walked into the grand hall, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. Her eyes scanned the room, and as she looked toward the royal guard, a slight pause took place in her mind. It was a moment of realization. Today was the day she would assert her authority, not as a figurehead but as the queen, with confidence. Camilla approached the front of the room where the royal guards stood in their usual formation. She stopped for a moment, allowing the silence to settle over the hall. All eyes were now on her. She straightened her posture and, in a commanding tone, issued her order. "Salute now," she said firmly. expecting the familiar movement of the guards bowing their heads in respect and raising their weapons in salute. But what happened next took her completely by surprise. The royal guards remained perfectly still, their eyes forward, their faces impassive. No salute, no bow, not a single movement. For a moment, Camilla stood frozen, her command still hanging in the air. Her mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened. This was not the way the royal guard had ever acted. There was a coldness to their stillness, an almost defiant air that left her stunned. She glanced around the room, her eyes catching the faces of the staff and dignitaries who were equally silent, unsure of how to react. Everyone had witnessed it. The Queen had commanded a salute, and it was not given. It wasn't just the guards' lack of action that unsettled her. It was the complete absence of the respect she had come to expect. The gesture that had been automatic, that had been part of royal life for centuries, had been denied. Queen Camilla could feel her heart pounding, her confidence beginning to falter. She had expected this moment to be a show of power, a declaration of her authority. Instead, it had turned into an uncomfortable silence, a challenge to her position. The silence stretched on, and in that moment Camilla realized that this wasn't just about a salute. This was about something deeper. Something was shifting within the palace walls. The royal guard, once a symbol of unwavering loyalty, was no longer responding the way they always had. The Queen's authority, it seemed, was now being tested in a way she had not anticipated. But what could she do? How could she regain control of the situation? Camilla's thoughts swirled, but she knew she couldn't back down. The eyes of the entire room were upon her, waiting for her to make the next move. With all the grace and dignity she could muster, she repeated the order louder this time. "Salute now." Still no movement. The tension in the air was suffocating. The guard remained motionless, their faces betraying nothing. The Queen's humiliation had begun, and it was clear that her once absolute authority was not as strong as she had hoped. Queen Camilla stood frozen in front of the royal guard, her command hanging in the air like a heavy weight. The silence was deafening. For a moment she couldn't quite grasp what had just happened. How could they ignore her like this? This was not just any group of soldiers. These were the royal guards, the elite of the British military, expected to follow the commands of the monarchy without hesitation. And yet, there they stood, motionless, their faces stern and unreadable. As the tension in the room grew thicker, Camilla's mind raced. Had she made a mistake? Was this a momentary lapse in discipline? She glanced around the room, trying to make sense of it all. The staff and dignitaries who had witnessed the scene were just as stunned as she was. They hadn't expected this. Everyone knew the royal guard's job was to stand tall, salute, and show respect to the monarchy. But now that respect was clearly absent. The royal guards had always been a symbol of loyalty and pride in the monarchy. Their uniforms were immaculate, their posture rigid, and their training was rigorous. They were the face of tradition, and their sole purpose was to protect the royal family and uphold the dignity of the crown. Camilla had always felt the weight of that dignity. Her position as the queen consort carried a certain level of respect that she had become accustomed to, even if not everyone fully embraced it. But this was different. This wasn't just a slight. It felt like a deep challenge to her authority. It wasn't long before the leader of the royal guard, Sergeant Alexander Fitzroy, stepped forward, his boots clicking against the marble floor as he moved toward the Queen. His face was composed, almost too calm, but there was a glint in his eyes that suggested something more, something hidden behind his stoic expression. Fitzroy had been with the Royal Guard for years, and in that time he had developed a reputation for being fiercely loyal to the monarchy. But loyalty was a tricky thing, especially in times of change. As Camilla watched Fitzroy approach, she could see the tension in his movements. He wasn't acting like the confident, unflinching leader of the Royal Guard that she had always expected him to be. Instead, there was something uncertain in his eyes, something that suggested he was grappling with an inner conflict. He stopped a few feet in front of her, standing at attention, but his posture was not as rigid as it once had been. The Queen's heart sank. She could sense that something had shifted in him, something that was more than just a refusal to salute. "Sergeant Fitzroy," Camilla said, her voice steady but laced with an unmistakable edge. "Why did the guard not salute when I ordered it?" Fitzroy met her gaze, and for the first time she noticed a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. He cleared his throat before responding. Your Majesty the guard. We're following protocol, Camilla frowned. Protocol? She repeated, her voice growing colder. This is not about protocol. This is about respect. The guards salute the monarch. It's a tradition. Why did you not obey my command? Fitzroy hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around as if looking for the right words. Finally he spoke again, but this time his tone was more measured. Respect, Your Majesty, is earned, not demanded. Camilla's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had expected him to apologize, to explain away the incident with some excuse, but instead, he was challenging her authority in front of the entire court. It was something she hadn't expected, not from him and not from anyone in the palace. The shock of it left her speechless for a moment. How could he speak to her like this? She opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. What could she say? She had always known that there were whispers in the palace, rumors of discontent among the younger generation of the royal guard, but she had never imagined it would come to this. She had never thought that the very people who were sworn to serve the monarchy would openly defy her. Fitzroy stood there, waiting for her response, but she didn't know how to react. The silence stretched on, awkward and heavy. Finally, with a deep breath, Camilla regained her composure. She was the queen, after all. She couldn't let this challenge go unanswered, even if it stung. Are you suggesting that I do not deserve the respect of the royal guard? She asked, her voice sharper than before. Fitzroy's gaze softened, but there was no sign of fear in his eyes. No, Your Majesty, he said calmly. I am not suggesting that. I am simply saying that respect is something that has to be given willingly, not through a command. For a moment, Camilla was stunned. This was not the response she had expected. She had assumed that as queen, her word was final, that her position automatically commanded respect. But Fitzroy's words made her realize something important. Respect couldn't be forced. It had to be earned, and maybe, just maybe, it had been slipping away from her without her even realizing it. The room was still silent, and the tension felt as though it might explode at any moment. The guards stood at attention, their faces impassive. Fitzroy was no longer looking at her, his eyes fixed on a distant point on the floor. There was a stillness in the air, almost as if the entire palace was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Camilla looked around the room, her mind racing. She had spent so many years supporting King Charles, quietly standing by his side, never seeking the spotlight. But now that she was the queen, everything had changed. She had to prove herself, not just to the people of the kingdom, but to those closest to her. The royal guard, the ones who had sworn loyalty to the crown, were now the ones questioning her authority. How could she regain their respect? How could she restore the power she once thought was unquestionable? She took a deep breath, straightening her posture. This was not the time to show weakness. She was the queen, and she would not be intimidated by a moment of rebellion. I see, she said, her voice calm once more. But remember, Sergeant Fitzroy, it is the duty of every royal guard to serve the crown, regardless of personal feelings. Fitzroy met her gaze once again, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. The air was still thick with tension, but Camilla could sense that something had changed, not just in her, but in him too. The guard's defiance wasn't just an act of rebellion. It was a sign that the world around her was shifting. The monarchy and its traditions were no longer as strong as they once were. It wasn't just about holding power. It was about adapting to a world that was rapidly changing. Fitzroy didn't respond. Instead, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. A recognition that things were no longer the way they had been. Camilla turned away, her thoughts swirling. This was far from over. She had lost something today. Not just a salute, but a sense of control. And it was clear that the days ahead would be filled with difficult choices. Not just for her, but for the entire royal family. As she left the grand hall, her mind remained clouded with the weight of what had just transpired. It was a turning point, one she hadn't expected. The royal guard had not just defied her. They had shown her that respect, loyalty, and authority were not as easily secured as she had once thought. Camilla had a long road ahead of her, and the path would not be as easy as she had hoped. Queen Camilla walked out of the grand hall, her mind spinning with thoughts she couldn't fully process. Her heartbeat was still quick, her face flushed with the sting of embarrassment. The royal guard's refusal to salute her had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She had expected obedience, a sign of respect under, but instead she had faced defiance. And not just any defiance, but one that had been open and unapologetic, standing before her like a towering wall she couldn't break down. She could still hear Sergeant Fitzroy's words in her mind. Respect is earned, not demanded. The words kept repeating in her head like an echo, haunting her every thought. How had it come to this? She was the queen. She had the title, the crown, the authority, and yet it was as though none of that mattered anymore. The truth was becoming clearer with each passing moment. The respect she thought she commanded wasn't as solid as she believed. As she made her way down the long corridor of the palace, her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. The silence around her was oppressive, each step heavy with the weight of what had just happened. She passed by several staff members, but none dared to look her in the eye. They had witnessed the scene in the grand hall, and now as she walked past them they were careful to remain perfectly still, pretending to be busy with their tasks. Camilla's presence was felt, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the kind of respect she had grown used to. For the first time she felt truly alone in the palace. In the days that followed, word of the incident spread like wildfire throughout the royal household. Everyone had seen what had happened. The Queen's command had been ignored. The royal guard's refusal to salute was more than just a simple act of defiance. It had turned into something larger. It was a symbol, and symbols had a way of spreading quickly, especially in a place like the royal palace, where gossip could travel faster than anything else. Camilla could feel the change in the air. The once constant respectful greetings from her staff and the dignitaries were now accompanied by hesitant glances. Whispers followed her wherever she went. She could sense the shift in the way people looked at her. It wasn't just the royal guard anymore, it was everyone. Her every move seemed to be watched, analyzed, and judged. The respect that had been there, quietly hovering in the background, was no longer a given. It was as though people were waiting for her to prove herself, to show that she could maintain her position, that she could still command the same loyalty that the monarchy had always had. Camilla spent the next few days in her private chambers, alone with her thoughts. Her advisors had been careful not to mention the incident directly, but their discomfort was obvious. They knew that something had changed, but they didn't know what to do about it. The Queen's advisors were all seasoned individuals, experts in royal affairs, accustomed to managing the delicate balance of power in the palace. But this was different. This was personal. This was Camilla's authority being tested in a way none of them had ever anticipated. At night, as she lay awake in her bed, Camilla replayed the moment in the grand hall over and over again in her mind. She thought about Fitzroy's face, his calm expression, his unwavering stance. She had expected him to cower, to apologize, to immediately correct his behavior, but instead he had stood there with quiet confidence as if daring her to do something about it. He hadn't moved. He hadn't flinched. And now she realized the same thing was happening across the palace. Everyone was waiting for her to flinch, for her to show weakness. They were testing her to see if she could handle the pressure of the throne. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Camilla's heart skipped a beat as she wasn't expecting anyone. She rose from the bed and opened the door, and there stood one of her most trusted ladies-in-waiting, Lady Eleanor. Her face was kind, but there was a nervousness in her eyes. "Your Majesty," Lady Eleanor began, bowing her head respectfully. "There's been some unrest among the court," Camilla frowned. She already knew what this was about. "Tell me, Eleanor," she said softly, her voice still weary from the emotional toll of the last few days. "The courtiers are, well, they're talking, Your Majesty, about the guard, about your authority. People are beginning to question things." Eleanor hesitated as if unsure whether to continue. Camilla sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "What are they saying?" They're saying that the guard has lost respect for you," Lady Eleanor said, her voice low. "And, Your Majesty, I'm afraid that means others will too. If the guards aren't following your commands, how can the rest of the court? How can the people?" Camilla's breath caught in her throat. The words stung more than she had expected. It wasn't just the royal guard anymore, it was everyone. Her authority, once so absolute, was now being questioned on every level. "Is that all they're saying?" Camilla asked, her voice trembling slightly. "No, Your Majesty. They're also saying that perhaps it's time for a change." A shift in the monarchy, Lady Eleanor continued cautiously. Maybe they're saying that King Charles needs to step in and take more control. Camilla felt a cold chill wash over her. The thought of her husband being called to take over, to take the reins from her own, was more than she could bear. She had always been in his shadow, supporting him in his role as king, but now the very idea of him taking over her duties felt like a threat. A threat not just to her position, but to everything she had worked for. She had been through so much to become queen consort, and now it seemed the people around her were ready to strip that from her too. Is that what you believe, Eleanor? Camilla asked, her voice steadier now, though the pain in her chest was evident. Lady Eleanor hesitated, biting her lip. No, Your Majesty. I believe in you. But I think there are many who are beginning to question whether you have the strength to lead. The words hit Camilla like a blow. It was one thing to feel the weight of the situation herself, but hearing it from someone she trusted made it all the more real. She had thought that her position was secure, that the monarchy's traditions would hold her up. But now she realized the world was changing around her, and it was no longer enough to simply wear the crown. She had to fight for her place. She had to prove that she was worthy of being queen. That night, as she lay in her bed once again, Camilla's mind raced. She had always believed in the monarchy, in the strength of tradition, in the loyalty of her people. But now she was beginning to see things differently. She realized that respect couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned, just as Sergeant Fitzroy had said. And if she wanted to regain control, she would have to find a way to prove herself. She couldn't just rely on the title of queen. She had to show everyone, her staff, her court, the royal guard, that she deserved their respect not just because of who she was, but because of what she could do as their leader. The road ahead would be difficult, but Camilla knew she had no choice but to rise to the challenge. She had to prove herself not just to the royal guard, but to everyone who had begun to doubt her. The path would be long and filled with obstacles, but if she wanted to maintain her place in the monarchy, she had to fight for it.